Hi, everybody. Wow, thank you so much for coming this evening. What a great audience, and I'm seeing lots of our old friends here in the chat tonight and a lot of new people too, so that's awesome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs at the Mark Twain House and Museum, and I'm delighted to be part of this program this evening with Kimberly Kersey and Gretchen Sorin, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. I'm also just delighted, as I said, to see so many people joining us tonight for this timely topic. I will say that Gretchen had agreed many, many months ago to come in person to talk about her book, Driving While Black. And that was supposed to happen, I think, May 19th or something like that. And of course, that was not able to happen in person. We're really, really happy that we're able to make it happen virtually now tonight. So thank you to Gretchen and Kimberly for working with us on that. I'm going to be really quick. I do have a little bit of housekeeping to do, and I wanted to talk to you briefly about a couple programs that are coming up, and then I will hand things over to Kimberly and Gretchen. First of all, I want to say that there are a lot of Mark Twain House staff and trustees and volunteers in the audience tonight. So you guys say hi and wave to the folks here. Other people in the chat area, please let us know where you're from. We love expanding the Mark Twain House family. And so tell us who you are and where you're from, and we'll be glad to meet you. Throughout the evening, you'll see that there's a green button beneath us. It says Birdies for Charity, adds 15% to your donation. I cannot tell you how important it is, particularly at this moment, for the Mark Twain House and Museum to receive donations from people like you, large or small. And honestly, large or small, I mean that. We did just, I'm very happy to say, reopen to the public for tours this past weekend, and our tours have been selling out, and we're so grateful for that support as well. But you can really help us through this trying time by clicking that donate button and knowing that at this moment until the 28th of June, which is just a few days away, the Travelers Championship will add 15% to your donation through its Birdies for Charity program. So if you are feeling able and willing to give us a little bit of money to help us out, know that it'll go a little bit farther if you do that tonight through this program. I also want to point out that during the evening tonight and after tonight too, you'll have opportunity by clicking the link in the chat section to purchase a copy of Driving While Black, and that will come to you signed by virtue of a book plate that Gretchen's going to sign and that we'll affix in there. So, and know that your purchase through the Mark Twain House and Museum store benefits the Mark Twain House again. So thank you for that. And I will keep that link active so you have it right in front of you. Just a couple more things I want to tell you about some other programs coming up tomorrow night through our online version of our very popular 10-year-old Trouble Begins at 5:30 program called Trouble at Home. Steve Courtney, the host of that series, will be talking with a man named Alan Rankin, who you should tune in and hear the whole story. But Alan is one of the few people in the world who knows an awful lot about Nina, who was Mark Twain's granddaughter, daughter of his middle daughter, Clara. And it's a fascinating story, and you won't want to miss it. And even people on staff who know everything about the Clemens family are like, oh, wow, there's so much we don't know about Nina. So please join us for that. That's a free program also. In 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, we are mounting a major extravaganza. It is going to be our Writers' Weekend, July 10th through 12th. And while most writers' conferences have been booted to the fall or winter, we decided to take the plunge and do ours virtually. And it is quite the adventure, as I said. Only $75 for a huge, wonderful lineup. Sophronia Scott, Mike Reese, and Scott Dickers, who's the founding editor of The Onion, are our keynote speakers. And there are more than 24 other speakers and presenters through the course of the weekend. And we'd love to see you there. So check that out. You can learn all about our programs at our website, which is cleverly named marktwainhouse.org. I came up with that myself, and I'm very proud of it. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop yapping now and introduce our guests and get started for the evening. So we're just delighted to have both of you. Kimberly Kersey, welcome to Hartford a few months after your arrival here. Kimberly is the new executive director of the Amistad Center for Art and Culture at the Wadsworth Atheneum. And she has a BA in art history from Rutgers University. And she also has a JD from Villanova. She's been very active in politics and civic engagement, and we're just really glad to have you in Hartford, Kimberly, and glad to have you here this evening. Oh boy, Gretchen.
Thank you.
Still there? So Gretchen Sorin is a distinguished professor and director of the Cooperstown Graduate Program of the State University of New York. She's curated a whole bunch of exhibitions, and including for places like the Smithsonian, the Jewish Museum, and the New York State Historical Society, New York State Historical Association. And her book, Driving While Black, is awesome and so interesting, and we'll hear a lot more about that tonight. Driving While Black is the basis for a full-length documentary for PBS. It's directed by Rick Burns. So look for that soon, and I think we're going to hear a little bit about that tonight too. So with all of that, I'm going to hand things over. Please join me in welcoming Kimberly Kersey and Gretchen Sorin to the virtual Mark Twain House and Museum. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one really important thing. Questions. We're going to do Q&A at the end. We won't look at questions that you pose in the chat area. Please pose your questions down and ask a question at the bottom of the screen. Ask a question aggregates your questions, and so the more people who want to hear something answered, the higher up on the list that question will get. So I'll be popping back on at the very end to facilitate that. And now I'm really leaving.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Jennifer. And thank you, Gretchen, for chatting with me tonight. It's good to see you again, virtually, but good to see you on the screen. So the title of your book, Driving While Black, such a loaded statement, one that's taken on different meanings at different points in history. What's it that led you to write on that particular topic?
Well, I actually started out writing about the Negro Motorist Green Book, which is a travel guide for African-American travelers during the Jim Crow era. And as the more I got into the subject, I realized that the Green Book and all those other travel guides are really about the automobile and how important the automobile was for African-Americans. And there are lots and lots of books that talk about the importance of the automobile, but they primarily deal with white America. And they don't deal with how different it was and how important it was for African Americans to have cars. And so I kind of shifted focus from these travel guides to the automobile. And when you're thinking about African Americans in the automobile, Driving While Black is really important. And it really relates these historical stories to what's going on in the present.
It sure does. I love it when a book surprises me. And as I was getting further into your book, it was such an unexpected bonus to learn some of the actual history of the automobile, as you just mentioned, and to learn about some of the unique characteristics that were important to African-American car buyers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. As I got into it, I started wondering, did African Americans drive different cars than other people? And I was really curious about this idea that, Black people drive these big fancy cars like Cadillacs. So I was fortunate enough to find some market studies. There was market research done in the 1940s and 1950s by market research firms for the Black press. And these firms asked people what kinds of products they bought, Black people. And one of the things that I discovered, was that there were very specific criteria when you were buying a car. And most African Americans wanted big, heavy, large cars. So I wanted to interrogate that idea. Why did you want a big car? Why did you prefer a Buick over a Ford? why would you prefer a Buick over a smaller car, a Hudson, for example? And what I discovered was if you were Black and you were driving, you needed a huge trunk because you had to carry your food. You carried blankets and pillows so that you could sleep in the car. You might carry an extra can of gas because you didn't know if you could stop at a gas station. You might carry some extra fan belts. You certainly carried water in case your radiator ran out of water. So you had all this stuff that you had to pack into your car, including your family, and you needed a big, heavy car. You also needed to think about, okay, if I encounter an angry mob, what kind of a car, what kind of a weight do I need in my car to keep the mob from being able to turn my car over? A Buick was a big, heavy car. And it was really hard to turn it over. So I don't think white Americans ever thought about the same things. They didn't have to worry about sleeping in the car, right? You could stop at any hotel. You didn't have to worry about carrying all of your food. You could stop at a restaurant. So when you say that Black Americans drove fancy cars, yes, they did. And big cars, yes, they did, because they didn't want to get stranded and they needed to carry all the stuff. The question of Cadillacs. African Americans drove Cadillacs in the same percentage that white Americans did, 3%, 3%. And that's it. So that's a stereotype. Performers drove Cadillacs. Mahalia Jackson drove Cadillacs. Sammy Davis Jr. drove Cadillacs. Chuck Berry drove Cadillacs. One of his Cadillacs is at the Smithsonian. But most African Americans chose a big, sturdy, heavy car. And there's one other thing to consider, and that is, if you were Black in America and middle class, it was very likely that you would not be able to buy a house. The realtors and the bankers colluded and prevented African Americans from getting mortgages. It was really hard to get a mortgage and buy a house. If you can't get a mortgage, what is the next largest purchase that your family might make? It's an automobile. If you had disposable income, you had more money to put into an automobile because you couldn't put it into a house.
That was something I hadn't thought about until I was reading your book. I thought that was really fascinating. So you talked about the size of the cars, the weight of the car, being able to sleep in the car and carry everything you needed in the back of your car. How did those considerations and characteristics factor into the civil rights movement?
The civil rights movement could not have existed without the automobile. The automobile really was one of the most important tools that they had that made things work, that made it happen. So if you think about it, there are a couple of ways. First of all, the Montgomery bus boycott, and there were boycotts in other cities. There were boycotts in Florida, boycotts in Alabama, boycotts in Mississippi. If you were going to sponsor a boycott, you needed to have people who would drive people to work. People didn't want to lose their jobs, right? And they couldn't all walk to work. So in order to be able to get to work for the Montgomery bus boycott, for example, Martin Luther King and the organizers purchased a fleet of station wagons, and they used those station wagons to drive people to work. They also enlisted the Black cab drivers to drive people to work, and they enlisted people that owned private cars to drive people to work. Without those cars, the boycott would not have been successful. What those cars were able to do was to cut the bus company's revenue by 69%, which is huge. 69% was just an enormous amount of revenue. And that figure wasn't actually discovered until 2018, when the records from the bus company were discovered in the attic of the granddaughter of the bus company manager. So that was one way that the car facilitated civil rights. But if you think about it, if you were an organizer in the South, and you were trying to register people to vote, or you were trying to provide health services or educational services, literacy services, whatever services you were going to provide to people in rural southern counties, how would you get around a county, an entire county? You had to have a car.
You need the car.
So a car facilitated that travel for voter registration, for healthcare, for all of those services that civil rights workers provided. It also provided the opportunity for civil rights workers to go to the sites of lynchings, the sites of burned churches. Medgar Evers had a Rocket 88, and it was an Oldsmobile. It was a huge car. It was really fast, and it would enable him to get away from the Klan or to get away from whoever was chasing him. So that was another way that civil rights was affected by, I should say, impacted by the automobile. And I think the final way is that civil rights workers often flew into a city. They'd fly to Atlanta, they'd fly to Birmingham, they'd fly to Selma, and they would be stuck at the airport because black cabbies were not permitted to pick up white people, pick up black people at the airport. So if you get to a southern city, you're stuck there. But if you could get a rental car, then you could get to the Black Hotel, which was the only place you would be allowed to stay. So that also, you needed a car, and and a rental car was available to black people. So
I love how you talked about.
That's important, I think.
I loved how you talked about the automobile really being a sort of equalizer between blacks and whites during this period of time. There were so many indignities being suffered on the buses, on trains, where there was not a lot of control over your physical surroundings and how you'd be treated. But getting inside of an automobile, you had this space that was your own that you could really control. And psychologically, what a great factor that was just in the psyche of Black Americans.
And I think it was so important for parents, because parents did not want their children to face those indignities that you would get on the colored car of a train or the colored car of a bus. And by putting their kids in the back seat of the car, they didn't have to hear it. And I think that was so important. And I interviewed people from my generation. We would be the kids' generation. And I interviewed people from the parents' generation, the drivers. And they all said the same thing. We didn't talk to our kids a lot about what was out on the buses and the trains, but putting them in the back seat of the car was like a protective bubble. It's like a racial shield.
In one of the stories that you accounted in your book, it was that type of an interview, and it was interesting that from the parents' perspective, there was a lot of nervousness setting out on the road as a Black traveler and not knowing what you're going to encounter, having to be able to read the map and not wanting to stop for gas. But as a child, some of the stories that you shared, it was a living room on wheels, and you could view America from the safety of your home, essentially, with not a lot of fear. And that was a great gift for parents to be able to give their children.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There's been some timely discussions as of late about African-American imagery. Specifically, we've heard of Uncle Ben's and Aunt Jemima and some of the mammy and servant type images being used for product placement and advertising. And, I wonder what it was like. I mean, your book is full of wonderful original photographs of that time period. And seeing some of the advertising photographs, being a traveler, a Black traveler on the road, and seeing billboards, these life-size, larger-than-life billboards with these racist images as you pass by, I can only imagine what that must have felt for the driver, for the mom and dad, knowing that this is what they were navigating.
Yeah, in my background, I'm an exhibition curator, and the way I really got started in thinking about this subject was that I just started gathering images and objects. And it's kind of the way I think. I'm a kind of visual thinker, and I'm always thinking about exhibitions and visual presentations. So one of the things that actually has led to the documentary was the fact that I had so many images of African Americans with their automobiles, but also images of what the roadside looked like. So trying to give the reader a feeling of what it must have been like for African American families to drive through the United States in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, when in any town or city, any roadside you might encounter billboards of racist, demeaning pictures, welcome to Klan country signs, signs in sundown towns that would say, nigger, you better be out of town by sundown, at the entrance to towns. And these were all over the country. There, Darien, Connecticut was a sundown town. It wasn't only the towns in the South. There were hundreds of sundown towns in the Midwest. And African Americans were driving through these spaces because they wanted to see the country just as other Americans wanted to see the country. And they wanted to take their children to museums and national parks and historic sites. And they could, because they had automobiles. They just had to take precautions, and they had to be careful where they went.
The perils I hadn't thought about was what happens if you get into a car accident, because inevitably that happens. So we can kind of guess what would happen from a police perspective, right? Probably whose side would be believed. But I hadn't thought about what happens from the health perspective. And if you're injured in an accident, there's a whole host of other considerations that go into that.
Yeah, even though I think the automobile was an incredibly freeing object for people, it freed them from this humiliation in the Jim Crow bus and car. It was also very dangerous because the hospitals were segregated, and there were only 200 Black hospitals in the United States up until the 1960s. And those 200 Black hospitals, not all of them were fully accredited. So if you happen to have a car accident in Washington, D.C., near Howard University Hospital, you would be well taken care of. Or if you happen to have a car accident near Meharry Medical School, you'd be well taken care of. But there were many other places where if you had a car accident, you would be in desperate straits, because not only were the hospitals segregated, and many white hospitals would not accept African Americans, but the ambulances were also segregated. So the rules were that if you were Black, what the equivalent of a 911 call, whatever it was in the 50s, 40s, if that call came through, they would say, are the people Black or white? So they knew which ambulance to send. If it was an accident between Black people and white people, the Black ambulance would have to wait for the white ambulance to pick up the white people first, take them to the hospital, and then go back and pick up the Black people and take them to the hospital. And if you're thinking about how much time it takes to get people out of a car to a hospital, this really did not bode well for the African Americans if they were badly injured. We do know most of a lot of the Black people that got involved in accidents were musicians and athletes, because they traveled the most. We know Bessie Smith died as a result of being in a car accident when she didn't get treatment. She wasn't taken to a hospital, and her arm was almost severed in the accident, and she bled to death. We know that there were a variety of other performers who also died as a result of the lack of health care, or they were one of the really sad stories, I think, in the book are the stories that talk about how people were taken from one hospital to another hospital to another hospital, and at each hospital they were turned away, and they would have to go to a hospital further on and further on and further on until many of them just died. from injuries that were treatable.
Right. So a big part of navigating African American road travel is the infamous Green Book, right? I think a lot of us think about the Hollywood movie when we hear Green Book, but in actuality, there's so much more to that than that Hollywood story. Can you tell us a little bit about how the Green Book shaped African American travel?
First of all, the Green Book was not the first travel guide. The first travel guide came out, excuse me, quite a few years before the Green Book. And during the Depression, the federal government actually put out a Black travel guide because they were trying to encourage African Americans and all Americans to travel so that the economy would improve. So you had this variety of travel guides out there. The reason we know about the Green Book is because Victor Green was a very savvy businessman, and he made a deal with Standard Oil to help him both support the Green Book and also to distribute the Green Book. So I think that is one of the reasons it's one of the most long-lasting of the travel guides. The other thing I think is important about the Green Book is that Victor Green dies in 1960, and his wife, Alma. I'm always talking about Alma because I think the fact that this was a woman-owned business after 1960, and the fact that Alma Green had 4 women working for her, it was a 100% woman-owned, woman-operated business from 1960 on. And she had been involved in the very beginning, but it was woman-operated all the way to the end. And I think in that time period, for a woman to be involved in publishing was really unheard of. It was really unusual.
Was it, you mentioned the women that were on the staff, but how did they gather all the information across the country and really, synthesize it down into one book?
There were a couple of ways. Victor Green and Alma had they had agents, and they had agents in different parts of the country. And one of them, whose name was Nellie Bass, Nellie Bass was the person who booked all of the acts for the Cotton Blossom Singers and the Blind Boys of Alabama. When the Blind Boys of Alabama and the Cotton Blossom Singers were being booked, she knew places all over the United States where they could stay. And she was one of the Greens' agents who helped, find places. The other thing that they did was word of mouth. They asked people that traveled to please send them information on places that they stayed, that they enjoyed, that they liked, that they thought were clean, that they thought were middle class, because Victor Green wanted middle class establishments. That was part of the Green Book, and this is the issue I take with the movie. Part of the Green Book was all about providing a list of acceptable middle class establishments, because some of the places that people stayed were dumps. And Victor Green wanted to make sure that people who were middle class travelers who were looking for middle class accommodations could find clean, well cared for establishments that had lots of amenities, just like the white hotels. And so he asked people to give references, to say, I stayed here at Miss Singh's boarding house, and it was really wonderful and very clean, and the food was great. And that was part of, I think, the motivation for the Green Book that was, say, different from the federal travel guide. And that was the quality of the establishments that he was putting in his guide.
I think it's such a testament to the publication and the want and desire for this information. I think I read in the book that it started off as a 16-page pamphlet of sorts, and by its end had grown into a 125-plus page yearly publication, which is amazing. That's a lot of information in one book.
And it was international. By the end, by the time it ended, it covered Africa, Europe, Asia, Canada, and Mexico, as well as the Caribbean. It was really international.
And is it correct that you mentioned there were other travel guides, but was there also a travel guide that was aimed at Jewish travelers?
So Victor Green writes something very tantalizing in the very beginning. He says that he gets the idea from his Jewish brothers and sisters. And so I searched for the Jewish travel guide. And what I found, and what Jewish scholars tell me, is that the Jewish travel guide was called the Daily Kashrut. And it basically tells you how to keep a kosher home, but also when you're traveling, how to find places that will cater to Jewish traditions. And also that won't discriminate, because American Jews found that they faced a lot of discrimination when they traveled as well. And if you called a hotel on the phone and you gave your surname as Greenberg or Schwartz, suddenly they wouldn't have any available rooms. And Victor Green saw that and he thought, they create guides and advertisements in magazines and in the backs of newspapers that tell people, here are places that will be welcoming to you. And he used that as his inspiration.
Give us an idea of the actual visual of the Green Book. I know you studied many of them. You actually looked at the books. How was it laid out? And I know it was information on places to stay and where to go that were welcoming, but what kind of information would be in there?
It's about the size of, it's small. It's about the size of a pamphlet. It would fit in your glove compartment, your glove box. It is about, the average is about 80 pages. It is on terrible paper. It's that awful, now brittle paper. So it obviously was meant to be thrown away. It wasn't meant to be saved, which is why I think they're so rare. And it was state by state listing alphabetically. And under each state, there would be names, addresses, and later phone numbers that you could call. But generally, people used to write. Before phones were widely available, people would write to a hotel or a boarding house. A lot of the places in the early Green Books are the homes of African-American families. And these were businesses. If a family had a spare bedroom, they might rent it to travelers to make extra money for the family. So a lot of the very early listings in the late 1930s, early 1940s, through the 1940s are things like Mrs. George Smith's boarding house or Mrs. John Jones' rooming house. And then there are also lots of colored YMCAs listed. And as you get later and later, you start to have hotels, black resorts, beach houses, places, motels, a wider variety of roadhouses, restaurants, all kinds of places, pharmacies, hairdressers, theaters, all kinds of services for African Americans as they travel.
Anything you might need while you're out there on the road, either at home or out on vacation.
And I think the more they got known, the more people signed up, sign me up, put me in the Green Book. This was a kind of incredible parallel world that African Americans created that was completely invisible to white Americans. And all of these services, all of these businesses that serve the segregated community, this is the irony, because they end up going out of business when segregation is ended. But you can imagine there's this vibrant community of all of these terrific places to eat, places to stay, beaches, places to visit that African Americans created out of segregation. Not something to be celebrated, certainly, because this was a horrible, horrible thing that they had to create this parallel world, but certainly an opportunity to show the resiliency of these people.
So I want to jump topics just for a second before we run out of time. And I want to talk about the police. So certainly there's a lot to pull from current headlines about policing. And in your book, you talk about the history of police and the real genesis behind the modern day police force. Talk a little bit about that. I thought that was a fascinating chapter in the book.
The very first police forces start as slave catchers. So the many of the urban police, and some rural as well, are men and sometimes women as well, pulled together, perhaps by the plantation owners, to go through the community at night, look for slaves who may be enslaved people who may have run away, and round them up, but also to strike terror in their hearts and prevent slave revolts, because people are afraid that white people are afraid that enslaved people are going to revolt. So these are the earliest, and they're totally legal because slavery is at this time legal. But this is how police departments begin. During Jim Crow, the police, these groups of slave catchers are now vigilantes. They're no longer legal. They're vigilantes, and many of them are in cahoots with the police. So we have people like Bull Connor, who is in league with the Klan and is permitting his Klan friends to murder civil rights workers. I think African Americans have, from the very beginning, have had this relationship with the police that's not a positive relationship. And the police, many police departments have a relationship with African Americans that's not a positive relationship, because they have bought into the stereotypes that are part of the larger society. And so we have African Americans afraid of the police afraid of African Americans, but the police are the ones that have guns.
This conversation really, it underscores for me that tension between the white officers and Black motorists. And it just kind of highlights that, like she said, this tension has been here since the beginning of the automobile. What we're seeing today really is nothing different than what we saw many years ago.
I think the only difference is now that people have cell phones. They're taking videos of it. I think this has been going on for a long time. There was just no evidence, no physical evidence of it. Nobody was videotaping it.
You had some particular words of wisdom that you shared with your own son when he became a teenager and got his driver's license and headed out on the road. Can you share with the audience what those words of wisdom were? It
was interesting because I've been talking with other parents, and now that my daughter is a parent to two little girls, she actually sent me a video recently of and I sent it to you, and it's heartbreaking. But African American parents have always talked to their children when they get a driver's license about the importance of driving while Black. What are the rules? The rules are you make sure you keep your hands on the wheel if you're stopped by a police officer. You never, ever make a sudden move. You don't go for your cell phone. You don't go for your wallet, unless you ask the police officer if it's okay. And you are exceedingly polite, even if you've been stopped for no reason. You don't give the officer any reason to get you out of the car or to hurt you in any way. And you put the light on in the car. You say, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am. You're very, very polite. And if you can turn your phone on immediately after you're stopped, if you have that opportunity. But after that, you never touch anything. And in talking to my friend, Faith Ruffins, who is in the documentary, and she's a historian at the Smithsonian, she said, your job she's telling this to her sons. She says, your job is to stay alive long enough for us to get to you if you're arrested by a police officer. So you have to do the work. You have to do the work of staying alive. And that means no sudden moves. Really, you have to make sure that you don't give the officer any reason to be afraid of you, because the officer's already terrified of you because of the color of your skin.
It's incredibly powerful.
I think that video, my daughter just burst into tears because it was a video showing an 8-year-old little girl holding her hands up like that and saying, my name is Ariel, and I am not armed, and I will not hurt you. And her father had drilled her to say this if she's ever in a position where she's in a car where the police are stopping them. And it's so sad for an 8-year-old little girl to have to think about that.
Incredibly. There's current talk of defunding the police and really addressing police brutality as it relates to people of color. In the epilogue of your book, you talk about what comes next, or what can be done with respect to police interactions. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think we've forgotten, but Barack Obama had a commission on policing, and they came up with a great report, which is online, and anyone can find it and read it. And I think it's got some incredible recommendations. I think the defund the police is a kind of unfortunate term, because it sounds so extreme. But I think that what it means is not don't fund the police. We need the police. We need police, obviously. But I think it means that some funds need to go to other priorities, and that police are being asked to handle problems that perhaps are better handled by others. So homelessness, for example, is something that perhaps is not something the police should be dealing with, or mental illness is not something the police should be dealing with. One of the things that I discovered in doing this research, I talked to the police commander of Montreal, of the city of Montreal, and he had some really interesting things to say that I think would be very beneficial to our police departments. One of the things he said was that he thinks of policing as mostly problem solving, and then this much law enforcement. So he thinks that most people are law-abiding citizens, and they may just have a problem that needs solving. And then there are those people that break the law, and that's a small number of people. And that's where law enforcement comes in. Instead of police thinking that their entire job is just to enforce the law. And he gave an example that I thought was a great example. He talked about a problem that they've been having in Montreal with Hasidic Jews. The Hasidic community there, in the wintertime, when it starts to get dark early, if they're on their way home from work, and all of a sudden they're in a lot of traffic and it gets dark, they'll just leave their cars right in the middle of the road, get out, and walk home. And that is a problem that needs solving. So what he told his officers to do was not to have the car towed, not to put the car into the impound lot. Then the person has to find their car, come down to the impound lot, pay a fine, go to court, goes into the system, give them a ticket, the whole thing. His idea was, you need to think about this as solving a problem. Get in the car, because they leave the keys in the car. Get in the car, pull it over the curb, problem solved. You don't have to worry about putting them in the system, putting a burden on the system, causing a lot of money to be spent, going to court, everybody getting lawyers. It's just problem solved. And I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about policing. The other thing he said was that in law enforcement, we spend our officers spend a lot of time on the shooting range, right? They have to regularly fire their guns and practice their shooting. They do not have to regularly take courses in how to work with people, how to diffuse tension, how to calm a domestic dispute. They spend lots of time practicing shooting, but no time practicing humanity. And I thought that was really interesting because I think it's true. Those of us who work with people on a regular basis, I teach students, we have regular interaction and actually regular training in how to teach, but also, how to deal with student problems and how to deal with, a wide variety of social, cultural issues. Why don't we do that with our police? One of the other talks that I gave, one of the men on the feed, on the chat, was talking about the fact that he was on a police community commission, and this was in New Jersey. This was last week, actually, in New Jersey. And he said that the only thing that the police wanted to do as a collaborative activity with the people in the community was go to the shooting range. I mean, that was his idea of how they could bond, was going to the shooting range, not sitting down and talking about how do you calm a volatile situation, how do you bring the temperature of that situation down. And I think those are the things that we really need to think about.
Yeah. Hopefully those types of ideas are the ones that kind of bubble to the surface, particularly right now with all that's been going on. So
absolutely.
Great ideas. So I'm looking, we have over 200 folks tuned in and joining us this evening. Jennifer, are there questions in the chat that maybe we have some time for Gretchen to answer?
There are so many wonderful.
I thought there might be.
In the chat. I need a moment because I am just absolutely mesmerized by this conversation and have so much to think about. Thank you so much, both of you, for just talking with us about all of this. We have 13 questions, and some of them have been seconded by people, so I'm just going to dive right in. And this person, I don't know who asked this question, but they asked, what about auto insurance? Were there companies that specialized in auto insurance for African-American auto?
Yes, there were. African-American insurance companies. They were among the wealthiest folks in the African-American community, the African-American insurance, the people that started African-American insurance companies. Yes, there are some large African-American insurance companies.
Interesting.
It was hard for African Americans to get insurance for their cars. And it was more expensive than for white Americans.
And I think the same listener wanted to know, do car companies, I think she means presently, do car companies market specific cars to African Americans? And if so, what models specifically?
I don't think, not that I know of. African Americans didn't appear in car ads until the 1970s. So until then, they didn't market any cars to African Americans. African Americans made these decisions on their own. But I will tell you that magazines like Ebony, Jet, Sepia, I'm trying to think of some of the others. They all ran advertisements for cars. And the Green Book, every year when the new cars came out, they would tell you about the cars. Think about this one and it comes in these colors, and think about this one and it comes in these colors. So there were places that African Americans could go to find out about the new cars, but it wasn't from the dealers.
Okay, interesting. So Ocean wants to know, did the Green Book precede what we now know as AAA travel guides for regions and states, or did they coincide?
The AAA travel guides came first. And AAA produced what they call the Blue Book. And I think that may be one of the reasons that Victor Green called his the Green Book, even though Green is his name. But AAA was totally racist. I mean, they did not include African Americans in anything that they did. And African Americans were not members of AAA.
So how do you know that? What kind of, somebody has, a couple people actually want to know where you did your research and where you learned about all of this.
Well,
question.
The book is based on a variety of sources. I did a lot of oral histories, as I said, of people in the back seat, as well as the people that would have been in the front seat, the parents, the drivers. I read every single African American newspaper, the Chicago newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Atlanta World. I mean, I read a lot of Black newspapers and magazines. I looked at secondary sources, all the white travel guides, the white magazines that didn't cater to African Americans, and the ones that were actually openly racist.
Oh, fascinating.
Bibliography. When I wrote this as a dissertation, the bibliography was 25 pages long. So it's
wow. So Jody Paulsgrove wants to know, in addition to
Jody
documentaries,
I know her. She's one of my students.
Well, she has a question.
Okay.
Is there any likelihood that there will be an exhibition related to?
Right now, I'm working on the documentary with Rick Burns. Hadn't thought about an exhibition at this point.
Can you tell us? Yeah, you and Kimberly and I had a little discussion the other night about the timing of the documentary. Can you give us any update as to when we might expect to be able to see that?
It will be on PBS in mid-October.
Awesome, very good. And how long? Do you know how long the documentary is?
I think that it's 2 hours.
Can't wait for that, and we'll keep our followers posted as to when to expect to be able to see that. So Anne O'Brien, who is one of our historic interpreters on the Mark Twain House staff, asks, did African Americans pay the same price for cars purchased as white customers and or the same interest rates for car loans?
That's a good question. I hope so. I don't know for sure. I don't know for sure. I would hope so, that the cost was the cost. Although I know how car dealers do it now. You know, that negotiated price. There are not, in the very beginning, in the 30s and 40s, there are no black car dealers. It's not until the 1950s that we start to get black car dealers. So African Americans were buying their cars from white dealerships or secondhand, or they were getting somebody to buy it for them.
Oh,
you know, they were using a friend to buy a car. So I assume that they were paying the same price. I'm not positive.
Fair enough. So were there places in the U.S.? Oh, I'm sorry. Hang on.
I was going to say, when the previous audience you turned me. Oh, okay. That's fine.
Oh, you're back on. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask my question?
Back on, Kimberly. So
okay. I was just going to say, as the previous audience member was asking about insurance rates, it made me think, well, how are these purchases even occurring? Because I doubted that there were black dealerships. Were there specific places where it was known that black customers might be treated fairly, or would everyone sell to a black purchaser?
Not everyone, but there were so many people that were willing to sell you something if you had the money. You know, even gas stations were like that as well. You know, there were places that were willing to sell you gas, but you couldn't use the bathroom.
Yeah.
You know, they wanted your money, but they wouldn't let you use the bathroom. So I think dealers were the same way. They were willing to take your money and sell you a car, even though you might be, you know, the segregation was very common. Also, I think for many African Americans, for many white Americans, it was acceptable to have a black driver. It was acceptable for black people to drive. Black people drove livery, they drove trucks, they drove buses, they drove, you know, they drove for white people very often. They were chauffeurs. And so it was considered an acceptable occupation for black people to drive.
Interesting.
And, you know, that kind of leads to a question from Carol Wolf in our audience. She says, well, were things different for African Americans who were visibly wealthy in terms of hotels and everything? If, you know, a proprietor could tell that this person had money, did that make any difference?
No. I think what's clear, especially when baseball players, for example, go to a white hotel, the white baseball players would be allowed to stay. The black baseball players would have to go find their own lodging somewhere. They'd have to go find a black hotel in the other side of the part of town. The same thing is true. Marian Anderson wasn't allowed. The reason that Marian Anderson becomes great friends, when Marian Anderson goes to Princeton, New Jersey, she is singing at the university. And the hotel, she goes to the hotel and they say to her, "Are you a Negro?" And she says yes. And they say, "Well, you're not staying here." So she has to find a place to stay. And Albert Einstein was then teaching at Princeton. And he says to her, "You can stay at my house." And that's what starts their friendship. So, you know, Marian Anderson couldn't stay at a hotel, even though she was invited to sing at Princeton. Other performers couldn't stay at a white hotel, even though they might own a Cadillac and be very wealthy. It didn't matter what your wealth was, your social class at all.
Wow,
And
so interesting.
One of the things that really gets the Green Book going as kind of middle class guide is that this is a time period in the 40s, the late 40s after the war, when all of the large corporations like Seagram's and Coca-Cola and Ford are starting to hire African American executives. So you have these black upper middle class men who are working for these corporations, and they have to travel to these corporations. And they travel to Chicago or New York or Atlanta, and they can't stay in a hotel room. So they start to become a market for the Green Book, the Green Guide, because they need to find places to stay that are suitable for a corporate executive.
Yeah. So one of our questions has to do with feedback from travelers. Did the Green Book publication workflow include traveler feedback to evaluate the quality of current accommodations, similar to what we see today on some retail and review websites? For example, could travel? No.
Green asked people to give his office feedback and to let him know. And he had a standard form letter that he put out every year asking people for recommendations. And he asked them about the quality of the places that they stayed. But that was not something that they published.
Okay. Interesting. So there are a couple questions here about today, young people buying automobiles. And whether we know whether there are criteria that they pay attention to and are concerned about when they're making a decision as to whether, first of all, to purchase an automobile and what kind to purchase if they decide to. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that question. I think that I do know that people continue to get stopped because of the kind of car that they drive. And I actually, I was contacted last week by Motor Trend magazine, and they wanted an article about this. And the editor of Motor Trend was telling me that he gets stopped all the time. He's white, and he gets stopped all the time. And he doesn't get stopped because of the kind of car he's driving. He gets stopped because he's driving too fast, because he drives Porsches and all these fancy high-end cars that he loves to drive, which is why he's the editor of Motor Trend magazine. And he said that some African-American people that he knows get stopped because they're driving a nice car. You know, the expectation is that African-Americans should be driving these beaters, you know, not driving a nice car. Or not driving an expensive car. That if you're driving an expensive car, the stereotype is, oh, you must be a drug dealer, or you must be somehow involved in some kind of criminal activity. If you're driving a nice car, so do I think that parents use the same criteria that were used in the past? I don't think so anymore. But I do think there is some concern about the types of cars that young people are driving, especially those high performance cars, as they're called, the fast cars.
Right. Well, thank you so much. That I think takes care of our audience questions, and I wonder if either of you has anything you'd like to say in conclusion. I do want to say, first of all, that I neglected at the beginning to thank our co-sponsors, the Amistad Center for Art and Culture and the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center were co-sponsors of this event. So thank you to both of those sister organizations from the Mark Twain House for your help with this. And I also want to point out that a number of people have said, well, how big an audience does the auditorium at the Mark Twain House hold? Because this one is clearly bigger. We hold 176 people there, and we've got 215 people registered here. So that's fantastic. So Kimberly and Gretchen, do you have anything you'd like to add before we say goodnight?
I just wanted to say thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, Gretchen, and getting to know you during this process. A fascinating book. I'd encourage folks to read the book. I know there is the documentary coming out, but the book really has a lot of personal anecdotes and pictures that really just brought all of this to life for me. So thank you for that. I'm looking forward to seeing the documentary.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This was great. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And one of our staff members, Steve Courtney, sent around a photo of the front cover of a green book. I don't remember the era, the date exactly, but it had a Mark Twain quote, which is one of our favorite ones at the Twain House. It says, "Travel is fatal to prejudice." And absolutely true then, absolutely true now. So I hope you'll both come back and talk with us soon. Thank you so much for spending the evening with us tonight. And thank you for our audience. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You too.